Okay, welcome everybody. I know that doorbell keeps chiming, but it's starting to slow down. And so I think it's a good enough time as any to get started. I want to welcome everybody to our third Advocate Integration Series session of 2020. The topic for tonight's session is Climate Change, a World on the Brink. We are very excited that you are here tonight. I want to introduce our panel first, and then I'm going to just spend a couple minutes talking about what we're doing here, why we have this integration series of events. So you are very fortunate tonight to be hearing from three of us. Dr. Jennifer Parkinson from anthropology, as well as Dr. Andrew Terrell from political science and international relations. And I'm Julia Kanzler. I am your FIC for Advocate LLC, and I'm also going to be speaking tonight. I'm from the Department of Sociology, but I also teach in the change-making minor, and I teach Introduction to Change-Making. So we're very, very excited that you're here tonight. This is obviously a topic that is near and dear to my heart as an environmental sociologist. So I'm excited to be a part of this. I just want to spend a couple minutes just introducing you to what we're doing tonight and why we have integration events. We at USD, as I mentioned to you the very first day that we met, one of the things that makes us kind of special is that we integrate a multidisciplinary perspective into our curriculum. And we provide opportunities for first-year students like you to practice and demonstrate in integration. And you get an opportunity to dive a little deeper into a multidisciplinary perspective through an integrative project that you'll be doing during your junior or senior year. So first year integration, we're just going to talk about this because this is what we're here to do. So we have learning outcomes for first year integration that we expect at the end of the LLC program, that you'll be able to recognize broad connections between multiple disciplines, perspectives, and approaches to learning. And that also you'll be able to articulate how the integration of different disciplines, perspectives, and approaches to learning can enhance your understanding of practical issues and problems. This is demonstrated through 2 assignments, and one of them is related to why we're here tonight. In the fall, this semester, you will all be doing an assignment that is shared by the entire LLC program. And it's going to be based upon the experience here tonight, where you're going to be able to articulate how you recognize connections between the talks from the 3 of us, as well as articulate how hearing from our different disciplinary perspectives allows you to understand the issue of climate change a little bit better, and how all of our talks and all of our perspectives relate to our common theme of advocacy and social justice. So you're going to be doing this shared assignment. You should refer to your syllabus or talk to your faculty advisor about when that is due. And then in the spring, you are going to have the opportunity to demonstrate your integrative knowledge through an integration project. And it's going to require that you create a project as directed by your faculty advisor that enables you to link your spring LLC course to your fall LLC course. So you should be paying particular attention to how your classes that you're taking now in the LLC relate to the topic of advocacy and social justice. And then the course that you take in the spring is also going to relate to advocacy and social justice. And you're going to be asked to create a project that links those perspectives together. So our hope is that at the end of the spring semester, you're going to be able to showcase a really innovative assignment that allows you to think broadly about how connections are made between disciplines. All right, so I'm not going to waste any more time because I'm hopeful that tonight we're going to have a chance for Q&A. So with that, I am going to stop sharing. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Parkinson from anthropology.
Hi, welcome. Let me share my slides here and get my screen up. Let's see. Okay, you guys can see my screen now, right? Okay, great. So I'm Dr. Parkinson from the anthropology department, and I'm going to speak today about the impact of climate change on human evolution. I'm a biological anthropologist, so I first want to introduce a little bit about this discipline. So what is biological anthropology? It's the study of human biology within the framework of human evolution. So we're interested in how humans, past and present, adapt to diverse environments. And we study this through examining modern human physiology and genetics, as well as the fossil record of human origins. So Earth's climate has always been in a state of flux ever since our ancestors branched off of the primate evolutionary tree millions of years ago. The planet has faced these drastic swings between wet and dry periods, glacial freezes and thaws. And it's clear that our ancestors were able to survive these changes. We're here today, right? But currently we're facing unprecedented changes in climate that we in particular are responsible for causing. And this is going to pose some real challenges ahead for us as a species. So in this talk, I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the important ways that humans have coped with climate and environmental change in the past. And then I'll talk about some of the challenges that we have ahead and some predictions about how this will affect the course of human evolution. And I'll end with some actions that we can take as advocates. So the human family tree goes back at least 7 million years to the time that we shared our last common ancestor with the chimpanzees. And since then, our family has had a diverse number of species that we refer to as the hominids. And interestingly, there is evidence that many of the turning points in human evolution, the appearance of some of the features that we think of as like defining humanity, they seem to be correlated with climate change. One of these turning points is bipedalism, or walking on two legs. So what does bipedalism have to do with climate change? Well, bipedalism evolved around 6 million years ago, if we look at the time scale of human evolution here. But we don't see full bipedalism appear until approximately 4 million years ago. The species Australopithecus afarensis, you may recognize her by her nickname Lucy. Australopithecus, or Lucy, is an example of an early biped. The Lucy skeleton, which was found in Ethiopia, has a human-like hip joint, a human-like knee joint that point to bipedal adaptation. Now, Lucy evolved around 4 million years ago, but prior to that, around 5 million years ago, sub-Saharan Africa was pretty much all rainforest, but the climate after 5 million years, the climate gradually became cooler and drier, leading to the spread of the savanna grasslands that we recognize in East Africa today. Now, Australopithecines like Lucy and earlier hominins lived in rainforest habitats, probably something like this, with plenty of plant foods to eat. They were probably frugivores like modern chimpanzees. But this change in habitat meant that they would have needed to range further each day to find food. And since food isn't as plentiful on a savanna. And bipedalism may have made traveling long distances easier. So we see this evolutionary shift from climbing in the trees to walking upright on the savanna. Now, two other turning points in human evolution are big brains and the development of stone tools. So roughly between 3 and 2.5 million years ago, Lucy's Australopithecine lineage became extinct, and the first members of our own genus, the genus Homo, appeared. And the first stone tools also appear around this time. They look something like these. And these early stone tools were simple stone flakes and cores, but basic stone tools like these would have opened up access to a whole range of foods. And we know from archaeological evidence that hominins began to use these tools to butcher meat from animals like antelope that lived on the savanna. And also around 2.5 million years ago, the earliest members of the genus Homo show the beginning of brain enlargement. And this became especially pronounced around 800,000 years ago in a species called Homo erectus. So larger brains allowed hominins to process and store information, to plan ahead, to solve complex problems like how to survive the new environmental challenges and climate challenges that they were facing. So how do we know that climate has changed in the past? There's been some really interesting work done drilling deep sea cores off the coast of Africa, where we can see these long records of undisturbed sediments through time like these. And they preserve oxygen isotopes, which reflect the ocean temperature, past ocean temperature. So this is a graph of change in oxygen isotopes through time. And looking at this graph, we can see two main trends. We see an overall decrease in temperature over time. So this is the present here. So there's this decreasing temperature over time. And also we see an increase in the degree of climate fluctuation over time. So we see this increasing variability in climate in more recent times. Now, interestingly, a comparison of this record of climate change with the human fossil record seems to indicate that some of the major changes in human evolution are correlated with significant climate change, or also correlated with periods of environmental variability. So notably, these are the origin of bipedalism, the advent of stone tools, the onset of long distance mobility, brain enlargement, and the expansion of symbolic behavior. If we look just at the increase in brain size over time, it seems to correlate with this period of strongest climate fluctuation over time that started around 1 million years ago. So we see this increase in brain size, especially during this period of high climate variability. So this data has led researchers to an interesting hypothesis, something that we call variability selection. That is that key human adaptations evolved in response to environmental instability. So natural selection wasn't always a matter of survival of the fittest, but also survival of those most adaptable to changing surroundings. So maybe some of the key human traits like upright walking, large brains, dietary flexibility, they weren't adaptations to like a specific new environment, but instead they were adaptations that made us adaptable. These traits allowed us to adjust to environmental uncertainty and change, which is good news for us. So speaking of climate change, the consensus among scientists, among climate scientists, as well as around 200 worldwide scientific organizations, is that climate change has been caused by human action. This is data from NASA showing the recent significant increase in atmospheric CO2. And for millennia, the atmospheric CO2 has never been above the threshold that it crossed in 1950. This is an undeniable correlation with human actions. Some geologists have even proposed that we should recognize a current new geological epoch, which we would call the Anthropocene. This would be defined as the period where human activity began to have a significant impact on the planet's climate and ecosystem. So basically the mark that we're leaving on Earth now will endure in the geologic record. So what will the impacts of climate change be on humans? Well, all species have an environmental niche, and despite our technological advances, humans are probably not an exception. For millennia, human populations have resided in a narrow part of the climatic zone on Earth, which has a mean annual temperature of around 13 degrees Celsius. That's about 55 Fahrenheit. And our production of crops and livestock is also pretty much limited to this zone. Now, a study just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences predicted that the geographic position of this temperature niche will shift more over the next 50 years than it has in the last 6,000 years. So this is the data that we're looking at here. Their model projected that by 2070, in the absence of migration, 1/3 of the global population will experience a mean annual temperature of around 29 degrees Celsius. That's around 84 Fahrenheit. And that's a temperature that's currently found on only 0.8% of the Earth's land surface. And it's mainly concentrated in the Sahara. So this current unsuitable area is shaded in black here. And the area that's projected to become too hot to be suitable by 2070 is shaded with these hash marks here. So climate change on this scale will trigger massive migrations. As droughts become more common and severe, people living in more arid areas will have to move to places with more reliable sources of water. And sea level rise will also force people to flee the coasts, where many of the urban populations of the world now live on the coasts. A recent study by the World Bank projects that climate change will cause 140 million people to migrate by 2050, with those now living in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America especially likely to migrate. We're not immune to this. One recent study that modeled the effects of sea level rise in the United States projected that by 2100, a 0.9 meter rise in sea level could place 4.2 million people at risk of inundation. And this includes our own San Diego County here. So what does this mean for us as a species? Well, plants and animals are adapting to climate change, and humans are not an exception. We will likely adapt to climate change in some ways that might be physically invisible and some ways that might be visible. One of the invisible ways we might adapt is by adapting to new diseases. So a warmer climate will mean an increase in insect-borne diseases like malaria, West Nile virus, dengue fever. These have primarily been confined to the tropics, but they will spread into temperate zones as our climate warms. And as a result, more people will be exposed to these illnesses, and our immune systems will be forced to evolve new defenses. As a result, also other non-infectious diseases could become more prevalent. An example of this, or a current example of this, is the blood disorder sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia arose because it has a beneficial side effect, which is that it confers some resistance to malaria. So diseases like this or new diseases could appear if malaria moves into populated areas in North America and Europe. Our digestive systems might also evolve in response to shifts in food availability. A past example of this is the evolution of some of our abilities to digest milk in adulthood. This evolved in groups in the Middle East and North Africa that began raising cattle around 8,000 years ago. And this is an adaptation to something cultural that we've created in our environment, dairy farming. And so this is something that we call biocultural evolution. So future generations might evolve better abilities to tolerate sugar and fat. There was an interesting recent study that found selection for reduced blood pressure and cholesterol levels over time in some populations in the US. So we could be evolving to our Western diet. Changing diets will also trigger changes in our microbiomes. This is the good bacteria and microorganisms that live in our guts. We already know that vegetarians tend to have a different mix of gut bacteria than meat eaters. And these changes could be exaggerated if prolonged droughts make it too expensive to raise livestock for meat. So these kinds of changes will mainly be invisible, but we might also show physically visible adaptations. Evidence suggests that a warming climate could blur differences between human populations that we often refer to as racial differences. We know that skin color differences came about as a result of natural selection, where darker skin was selected for near the equator to protect our skin from UV radiation. And you can see from this map that this is a map of the historic global distribution of skin color over time. And you can see that it closely matches the intensity of sunlight in different regions of the world, with the darker skin near the equator and lighter skin near the poles. In today's world, though, of course, we have sunscreen and vitamin supplements. So natural selection is less of a factor, and people are moving around, blending populations. So in 5 to 10 generations, which would be around 125 to 250 years, we may see fewer people on the dark end or the pale end of the human skin color spectrum, and more people kind of in the middle of the spectrum with olive or brown skin. Also, our bodies could evolve to become smaller and thinner to decrease our volume and maximize our surface area. This would let us lose heat more effectively if the climate warms, so we could keep cooler. Also, at least to some degree, technology and modern medicine will slow down natural selection. And this is the case in most parts of the world where babies no longer die in large numbers. We have modern medicine, right? People with genetic damage that once was fatal, they now live and have children. So natural selection is less of a factor. Also, natural selection can take thousands of years to produce change. And climate change is happening so rapidly that we're more likely to adapt culturally by changing our behavior. And that means that people in the developed world will be more likely to have the resources to deal with climate change, and people in the developing world will be left at a serious disadvantage. So something we need to think about. Good news though is that humans are smart and adaptable. So let's use the intelligence that we've evolved to solve this problem and to advocate for change. So I think I'm running out of time, but here are some actions that I just want to list that we can take to reduce the impact of climate change. And I'm sure we'll talk more about these, but we can cut greenhouse gases. We can vote for candidates and policies that help protect the environment, adopt a more sustainable plant-based diet, reduce food waste, and we can buy local. That is all. I will hand it over to one of our other speakers. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Parkinson. That was great. All right, I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Andrew Terrell.
Hi, everyone. Let me get up. I've got a few short slides. Uh-oh. I think I can do this.
I think Jennifer needs to stop sharing. There we go.
Does this work? Excellent.
Yes.
All right, everyone. Well, I've got 3 short slides. One is the title, so we'll be through with that in just a second. That's who I am. We're going to talk about climate change, politics, and the economy, but in brief. And I'm going to start because I know that everyone's heard of climate change, and probably many of you don't need any further explanation, but probably many of you aren't exactly sure how it works. I can say that before I went to graduate school, there were lots of things that I knew about, but I didn't really know how they worked. I get the impression that this, for most people in the world, is something we know about, but we don't exactly know how it works. And so this is a very imperfect, but kind of interesting graphic that attempts to explain climate change. It's an attempt to explain it to the general public. It was published in National Geographic. It's weird, and that's part of why I use it, because I like to talk about how difficult it is to communicate climate change. Of course, I think we all know climate change means that the temperature on Earth is getting warmer. That doesn't mean that all of the effects are about things getting warmer, and that's why it's so confusing for some people. The fact that Earth is getting warmer can mean in some places that it's wetter, and in other places it's drier. In some places it is indeed very hot, and in other places it can get very, very cold. What really, the only thing we can say to sum it all up is that it's getting more extreme. So in places where it's already wet, it tends to get wetter. In places where it's dry, it tends to get drier, and hot, even hotter, cold, sometimes even colder. The reason why, and here we get to this bathtub analogy, is because if you imagine the Earth as a bathtub, but instead of filling that tub with water, we're going to be thinking about filling it with carbon dioxide. That's what the tap there represents. And the Earth has always had a cycle where there's carbon dioxide that went into the atmosphere and carbon dioxide that was taken out of the atmosphere. Those of you who are interested in biology, or especially botany, realize that plants, for example, take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then anytime a plant, that living plant that is, anytime a plant dies or is burned, that carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. But what we've done as humans is that we've turned up that tap, and we're putting more and more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And you can imagine that as a bathtub that had a nice level in it, and now we've turned on the tap. And so there are a couple of things that we could do to stop it from overflowing. We've turned on the tap, I guess I should be clear, by burning fossil fuels. We have taken lots of stored carbon, and in burning those fossil fuels, we're releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. We'll get to in a moment to why that's not so good. But just to understand here, the tap is now, and this is 10 years old, so it's even worse, more like 10 billion metric tons a year. And there is a drain. The drain, again, are things like plants or the oceans, things that suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The drain can only handle 5 billion metric tons. That is, the tap is pouring out carbon dioxide about twice as much as the drain can handle in any given year. And so we've got a problem. It's like a bath about to overfill and overflow. And we've not only turned up the tap, but the drain is getting worse. It's a gross analogy, but it's like there's hair in the drain. And we've put hair in the drain by cutting down forests, by allowing the oceans to take on too much carbon dioxide and causing them, as they warm, they become less and less good at capturing this carbon dioxide. So we get rid of the forests, there are fewer plants to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. As the oceans warm, they also aren't so good. You can imagine this because if you like to drink fizzy drinks, you know that the fastest way to make them less fizzy is to let them warm. So the liquids cannot hold gases very well the warmer they get. And so as the earth warms and the oceans warm, they are less and less capable to help us get rid of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Why is it important to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? Because it acts, and you might have heard this analogy, like a blanket, or you've probably heard the greenhouse analogy. It forms a layer, and this is supposed to be what you see here with this little man standing on the earth here. As solar energy comes to Earth, a lot of it is absorbed by the Earth as heat. That's why the sun feels hot to us. And that's why things that are darker colors, like a asphalt, for example, it becomes hotter than things that are lighter colors because that is heat being absorbed. We know that lighter colors reflect more. So as the solar energy is reflected back out into space, and that was the nice balance we have, we absorb enough heat that it's a good temperature for humans, but we want some of that energy to be reflected back out into space. It's starting to bounce back to Earth because there is this layer of carbon dioxide that acts as an insulator and allows less and less of the heat to escape. What's worse, as it gets hotter, not only are the oceans warming up and belching more carbon dioxide or not able to hold it in for us, but the ice is melting. And that's bad because of the sea level rise that we have just heard about, but also because as that ice melts, we have less and less shiny reflective material on Earth. Ice is very shiny. It does not hold heat. It's really helpful in sending that energy back out into space. But as the ice melts, there's less of it. And so we have a feedback effect. Solar energy comes in, there's too much carbon dioxide because we've been burning fossil fuels and we've created this blanket layer. That causes the Earth to warm, that causes the oceans to not be able to help get some of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that would reduce the blanket, but it also melts the ice, which is less reflective material, which means even more warmth, which means even more ice melt, even hotter oceans, which means even more. Do you see where we're going here? It's a downward spiral. This is sounding really depressing, I know. It is kind of depressing, let's be honest. And so we're about to talk about what we can do differently. But I wanted to make sure that we're on the same page about what's going on here. One more thing to note is that all the energy on Earth is coming from the sun. Even things like wind. Wind happens because of temperature differentials. Even fossil fuels. Fossil fuels they're just old solar energy. It's carbon that's been trapped, that's been fossilized, old plant material, and in some cases animal material, but mostly plant material that was basically life generated by sun from millions of years ago. So every time we tap into a form of energy on Earth, we are tapping into the sun. And this is important for the next slide, where we talk about the problem in two dichotomies and two things that we can control. The first is that we have a choice between growth and development. And a scholar that, if you're interested in this, you might look up, named Herman Daly, put forth this impossibility theorem. Growth cannot be sustainable because all of our energy comes from the sun, even our fossil fuels, even wind energy, obviously solar energy, All of it comes from the sun in one way or another. Maybe you could, if at the point where we can start to do our own fusion energy, maybe we can deviate from this. But for now, all of our energy comes from the sun, and therefore our energy is finite. That's the first problem. So we are choosing a growth-based pattern that is not sustainable by its very definition. That is, as we continue to try to consume more and more, and you might ask, well, how do we know that we're aiming for growth? It's built into everything we do. We assume consumption will happen. We measure country success by GDP, that is growth of the economy. We measure our improvement by all kinds of quantitative growth, even though that is by its very definition unsustainable, and it's making us worse off. So one way of putting this is our growth at this point is uneconomic growth. As things get bigger, as we consume more, we are actually becoming worse off. This should not surprise us. We know that growth is not always good. I'm actually going to ask somebody to name a type of growth that we know is not good. Can somebody name a type of growth that we're pretty sure, I wish that growth weren't happening? Somebody be brave.
Population.
Cancer. What was the other one I heard?
Global population.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, and you could say that is a contentious one, but for sure there are arguments to be made that we have sustainable issues with population growth. Cancer is an obvious one, right? If somebody says, I have a growth, very few people are like, oh, good for you. I'm glad to hear that. We know that, and actually cancer is out of control cellular growth. Instead of, growth, obviously cellular growth is good in some cases, but in the case of cancer, it's gone beyond being economic growth that is making our bodies stronger and healthier, and has ventured into the uneconomic growth. And that kind of growth has been happening on a planetary level. And that has to do with the second dichotomy, resources versus waste. You often hear that we are in danger of running out of resources, but that's actually not true in most cases. There are some, like in some localized area, where you could say, yes, we might run out of water here, but on a planetary level, we are in much greater danger from the waste we're producing. That's why our growth is so uneconomic. And so this graphic on the right aims to show the very most pressing problems we're facing. Again, already this is a little old. And I want you to note that most of these problems have to do with waste. The climate crisis is about the waste from burning fossil fuels. Both the nitrogen cycle and phosphorus cycles, those largely have to do with the waste from farming, the use of artificial fertilizers. Ozone depletion has to do with waste from chemical processes. Ocean acidification is directly tied to too much carbon dioxide. So not only is the ocean getting warmer, but it's getting more acidic because it's desperately trying to help us suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Chemical pollution is obviously waste. The point here is that we're so afraid that we're going to run out of stuff because that's how we built our whole society, around the idea that we need more and more, that we need to consume more. And so our biggest fear is that we'll run out of things to consume, when our actual fear should be that we will consume so much that will create more waste than Earth can handle. So in most cases, the waste will overwhelm our natural and human systems well before we run out of resources. For example, if we ever run out of coal and oil, our goose will be cooked because of the amount of climate change that we create. Again, things could change. There might be a technological fix. That said, we've had a lot of attempted technological fixes that have actually just kicked the can down the road. So what I suggest here is we can focus on these two dichotomies. We can focus on a society that is more built around development, that is a qualitative improvement. Things get better for us rather than just bigger. Think about a tree that at first does want to grow quantitatively. It wants to get bigger, fast enough that a deer doesn't just come in and chew on it when it's a small sapling and destroy its life. It wants to grow up fast, but at some point a tree decides it's time to stop growing, because if I grow too tall, I'll just fall over. And I want to now develop as a tree, want to start to develop, to flower, to bud, to grow. And so in most cases, the waste will overwhelm our natural and human systems well before we run out of resources. to create fruit and nuts, to reproduce and create more trees. That is qualitative improvement. We're like the tree that just keeps trying to grow tall. Instead of saying, hey, we have enough now, let's work on distributing it properly. Let's make sure that people's lives are qualitatively good. Let's forget about just trying to measure whether we're doing well in terms of money created, and instead think about whether people are living good lives. If we could get past development, past growth and into development, we'd be a lot better off. And if we could see our problems for what they really are, that we have a huge waste problem, that we need to start thinking about how every time we produce something new, we are taking our natural capital and converting it into waste mostly. We get some use out of these products, but most of it's short-lived. Think about all of these phones that we have that are destined to be in some heap in a few years as they're outdated. Think about all the misery that will cause, little kids sorting through this electronic waste, trying to find the bits of metal that are worth trying to resell, the sickness that they'll have directly, but also the fact that we are going to use more energy and create more climate change, producing more telephones over and over again, and it seems unending. I'll stop there by saying all of this is avoidable. We have choices. And those choices come through governance. I mean, we'll talk a bit, I think, about some of our individual choices, and I think that's really important for us to make good individual choices. But ultimately, the kinds of changes we need, going from a growth-based system to a development-based system, going from a system that recognizes only how can we get more resources to a system that cares about the waste we're producing, that requires big system-level change, and that requires good governance. So I'll say, as we approach an election, I hope we'll hear candidates talking about these issues, at least climate change more, and I'm seeing it more and more, but thinking seriously about changing the system. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Terrell. That was great. All right, I'm up next. Let me just share my screen here. Get rid of this. So sorry, just give me a second. Okay, there we go. All right. All right, so I am Dr. Julia Kanzler. I'm from the Department of Sociology. I also teach for the Change-Making minor, and in the Advocate LLC, I teach Introduction to Change-Making. I will be talking about youth climate advocacy. I am a scholar of environmental sociology and also social movements. So this is something that I think about and care about all the time, young people getting involved as climate advocates. All right. But first, I want to talk a little bit about sociologists and what sociologists do and how it's related to climate change. So sociology is the study of human behavior. And what sociologists study? We study several things. We study, on the one hand, social structures. This is kind of what Dr. Terrell was talking about when he was talking about big systems. Social structures are these overarching systems that organize our society. So it could be the economy, it could be a system of law, it could be a religious system, it could be a mode of government. And if a sociologist, an environmental sociologist, wants to understand climate change from the purposes of looking at social structures, they may ask a question like this: how does capitalism contribute to climate change? And as Dr. Terrell was kind of getting at, it contributes to climate change in very significant ways in terms of our patterns of production and consumption. Sociologists also look at social institutions. Social institutions are really these complex social forms that reproduce themselves over time, like schools, universities. University of San Diego is a social institution. Corporations are social institutions. Social movements are social institutions. So we might ask as sociologists how different education systems lead to different levels of climate change awareness. For example, students who go to K through 12 education in public versus private school, does their education provide them with different tools to talk about climate change, to be knowledgeable about climate change? Does it enter the curriculum? Those might be some questions that we might ask. Another question that looks at institutions is how social movements emerge to address climate change. Do they emerge from the grassroots? Are they driven by nonprofit organizations like the Sierra Club and Greenpeace, first and foremost? Or are they driven, as we're seeing today, from young people who are taking to the streets? Sociologists also look at interactional level dynamics. These are very small dynamics with small groups and with individuals. So if we're looking at climate change from an interactional level, sociologists would look at the individual actions that people take to address climate change. Do they drive less? Do they eat less meat? Do they make purchasing decisions based upon concerns about the climate? Or how people talk to each other about climate change. Does it come up in everyday conversation? Does it not? What are some of the things that might inhibit those conversations from taking place? We are also very much interested in culture, our values, our beliefs, our norms as a society, and how this impacts climate change and whether or not it's a pressing issue in people's lives. So we might examine how certain cultural values, for example, in the United States, individualism can present obstacles to climate change. A hypothesis could be that in an individualist society, people are lacking potentially care for community, or as we put it at USD, care for the common home sufficiently that we prioritize the collective over our individual needs. And finally, sociologists examine systems of power and inequality in our society. We're very much concerned about how power is organized and how opportunities and obstacles are disproportionately distributed in our society. So if we're interested in climate change, we might examine how disadvantaged groups are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And they absolutely are. We know that people who live in poverty and people of color, people who are citizens of small island developing states, for example, that they tend to bear the brunt of climate related changes, at least at this point. And there's every reason to believe that that would be the case going forward. So that's what sociologists study and how it's related to climate change. But I teach introduction to change making. So how is that relevant to understanding this as well? Well, we believe that a change maker is someone who's intentional about solving a social or environmental problem, is motivated to act, and willing to be creative. Change making ultimately involves advocacy. And advocacy can take many different forms. It doesn't just have to mean taking to the streets and being an activist, but it can. It can involve individual action, like education and awareness, an individual committing themselves, if they care about climate change, to educating themselves about it and making lifestyle modifications in order to do their part to address climate change, like some of the things I mentioned before. It could involve activism and civic engagement. We see that in the current school strikes that we see that have been really examples of activism that orient around Greta Thunberg and her advocacy that's really taken off like wildfire through youth activists, through the youth corps in the last year or so. We also see protests taking place in our own communities, as well as land occupations taking place mostly on indigenous lands. Change makers who are interested and care about climate change, they also commit to prioritizing the needs of groups that are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Like I mentioned, people living in poverty, people of color tend to experience the impacts of climate change more acutely. And change makers who are concerned about that recognize that and prioritize their unique vulnerabilities over the needs of people in the developed world, for example, or corporations. All right. So I'm curious about you all and your own potential advocacy with regard to climate change. So I'm going to just send out a quick poll here to kind of see where you're all at. Give me just a second to launch this. All right. So there are the questions. I'll give you all a minute or two to answer. The first question: what best describes your level of concern about climate change? And then the second, what measures have you taken to address climate change? Choose all that apply. I guess I should have put also nothing. Oops. All right, I'm going to give you another almost 30 seconds. Got 87% of you. We're doing well. Okay, I'm going to close it down.
And for the second one, just, yeah, you just choose the ones that that you, I guess, care about the most. Somebody mentioned that you can only choose one.
No, you can choose all that. Oh, you can only choose one? Okay, good to know. That's okay. Here we go. All right, this is great. Okay, so what best describes your level of concern? 62% of you are very concerned, and another 32% of you are somewhat concerned, and very, very few, only 6% in the whole group are either neutral or unconcerned. And so, and I'm sorry that you could only pick one of these, unfortunately. I guess that's the limitation of the poll. But what measures have you taken to address climate change? So the ones that it seems like your number one priority, people shop locally rather than ordering Amazon. That's great. 27% of you said that. 21% have participated in an in-person protest event or march, eat a vegetarian or vegan diet. I love it. So a lot of you are making decisions in your lives that are directly focused on the issue of climate change. And the vast majority of you are either very concerned or somewhat concerned about this. And this is great. And if we gave this same poll to the general population, I know that we would actually see somewhat different results. In the general population, people are not quite as concerned as your generation is. So this is important. This is important to our current climate. It's important in terms of what the future of climate advocacy looks like, and in terms of addressing this issue. But it does seem to be an issue that some people are not as likely to engage in advocacy around, even if they're particularly concerned. And so there are some reasons that really prevent people from engaging in climate advocacy. And I'm just going to kind of list these quickly because I know time is of the essence here. One is that the impacts tend to be somewhat invisible and slow moving. The fact that, obviously temperatures rise very, very slowly, and the impacts tend to be ones that accumulate over time. And so it's challenging and difficult for people to perceive this in their own lives. Also, the impacts are oftentimes first felt elsewhere. We know with regard to sea level rise and the impacts that's having in some places of the world, they tend to not be felt where we're living. It tends to be something that's impacting the small island developing states, impacting indigenous people in the Arctic regions, and that's happening first. As far as droughts and heat waves, those are also things that we're starting to experience in the United States, but the initial impacts are oftentimes happening elsewhere. Another thing that prevents people from acting is that society is really structured around activities that contribute to climate change, especially activities that make our lives easy, such things as driving and flying on airplanes and switching the lights on and forgetting to turn them off, and the use of single-use plastics. These things make our lives easy. It's challenging to want to give up the things that we're accustomed to and that simplify our lives. Climate change is also tied to systems that seem hard to change, big things like the economy, capitalism in general, and power dynamics. Significant power dynamics are tied to the status quo, so that those in positions of power, whether they're corporate power or political power, have very little motivation to change things. And so this can be very challenging from the purpose of an advocacy perspective to even know where to start. When so many of the systems that are in place perpetuate climate change, and it can seem so very difficult to even know where to put our time and energy. We also tend to have faith in technological solutions. There's a belief that science fixes everything, and that if we put enough smart people in a room, that we're going to figure this out, that we can science our way out of climate change. But we know that we're rapidly running out of time to do that. But all of these things are social and cultural impediments to people actually engaging with climate change as a social problem and becoming advocates for becoming advocates around the issue. Despite all of that, young people are engaging like never before. And why is that? And I wish we had time to kind of poll you on this as well. But what we're hearing young people say is that they're engaging like never before because, like you said, they're very, very concerned about the issue. They believe that their future is at stake. They also believe that adults who are in positions of power to actually do something about this have lost their credibility to solve these problems. And so they feel like they're best equipped to actually take these things on, that they have the moral authority to do so, they have the time and energy to put into this, that they're less invested in the status quo, and they're well equipped to use things like social media as a mobilizing strategy. So young people feel like they are uniquely situated to be leaders with regard to climate advocacy, and we're seeing them do so. So I'm just going to spend a couple minutes now introducing you to some young climate activists, and some of them you may already know, and I'm guessing you know the first one. The first one, of course, is Greta Thunberg. Greta, as a 16-year-old young woman in Sweden, started striking from school in front of the Swedish parliament. Within months of her first school strike, hundreds of thousands of high school and college-age students around the world were joining her in school strikes for the climate. This quote really articulates the urgency of the problem, and young people really understand this urgency better than most, and are pushing people to do the same. So I love this. She says, "I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. I want you to act. I want you to act like you would in a crisis. I want you to act like your house is on fire, because it is." So there's Greta Thunberg. This is our Children's Trust. This is a group of 21 school-aged kids in the US who sued the United States government on behalf of all youth and all future generations in the United States, arguing that the US government violated their constitutional rights by failing to take meaningful measures to address climate change. The courts have unfortunately ruled against them so far, but they have vowed to continue the fight on appeal. So that's our Children's Trust. I invite you to check them all out later and see what cool stuff they've been up to. This is Isra Hersey. She's a climate activist from Minneapolis, and she's among a growing number of young activists of color who remind us that the climate movement is not just a white middle class movement, and it's not a white middle class issue, and that people of color bear a disproportionate brunt of climate impacts. In this quote, she talks about her struggles as a young Black woman in the climate movement. She says, "It was difficult to look like their token and attend their meetings, but I kept going because I wanted to change that. Being the only person of color in these spaces made me realize why it was so difficult for other people of color. So no, I don't strike every Friday because I can't, but that doesn't mean my activism is not valid." Here's Tokata Iron Eyes. She's from the Standing Rock Sioux Nation in North Dakota, and she was one of the primary organizers of the protests against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. You might be familiar with some of that activism that was taking place a few years ago. Indigenous people are uniquely suited to be leaders in climate activism because of the fact that they often live in places that are vulnerable to climate change. Many have deep-seated cultural values that promote stewardship to the natural world. And they have centuries, if not millennia, of traditional ecological experience doing just that. Yet often their voices are marginalized. I really love this quote because it reminds everyone that we're all part of nature and that we're all responsible for the negative impacts of development, and we're all responsible for their solutions. She says, "Whether we realize it or not, we are all colonized. At some point in time, we all lived in harmony with the earth, but we destroyed that. And then we continue to destroy each other. The trauma of being stripped of our connection with Mother Earth has caused generations of people to blindly follow a system of hurt." Okay, and the final activist is you. I am very excited to see how each of you will commit to being an advocate in the struggle to address climate change. And I cannot wait to hear your stories and to hopefully tell your stories one day to future students at USD. All right. So that's all I have. We've got 3 minutes. Maybe we can extend it by like 5 minutes and take some of your questions. I'm going to stop sharing quickly. So let's open it up for about 5 minutes or so with any questions that you may have for any of us. Don't be shy. Nobody? Nobody? You're like, oh, man, we've got 3 minutes. We want to go. Any final thoughts, reflections on the evening? Any points that stood out that you'll take home with yourselves tonight and think about a little bit more? Anyone thinking about how they can become climate advocates? No one.
Maybe I'll just share my last slide again, because I had a list of some things that we can do to help mitigate climate change ourselves. Let me see if I can.
There's a question also in the chat about how we think COVID has affected climate change.
I can take a shot at that.
Yeah, do it.
There was some hope that there was a silver lining, that because of the pandemic, we would start doing things differently and it would have a big impact. So people weren't flying anymore. People weren't driving as much. We weren't using as much energy. It turns out that that didn't do very much at all. And that's actually evidence of why we need to do system level change, because all of us were sequestered, barely being able to live a life that we think is pretty hard to sustain, giving up things that we're not willing to give up, going through a lot of sacrifice, and we still only reduced our carbon footprint by about 8% this year. It's not going to be us making those decisions that will change, because I actually think exactly what the Sioux activist was saying is exactly right. We are locked in a system. We can't help but have an impact we don't want to have, because regardless of what we do as individuals, the world works around climate change. It has been built into how we live, and we need to deconstruct that. So that's not to say making individual choices is unimportant. It's just not enough. So those individual choices have to add up to something more. So, if you have a vegetarian diet, because many of you mentioned that, that's great. And you may be doing it for other reasons as well. But the hope has to be that we change our entire food system. It can't just be a few people making that choice. It has to be a total revolution about how we eat. And so I think what COVID has shown us is that we need a bigger level reaction, that it won't be enough to just deprive ourselves. We have to actually make the world work for us. It can't be, I'm going to stop doing things I love. We have to figure out how to make our lives good in a way that's not destructive to our future lives and to future people and to other people right now who are suffering. That's what I would say.
So you think it's more of a structural revolution in a way, or economic revolution in a way?
I think it's all of those things. And so the fact that people are making good individual choices plays a role, but that is the role of example, of showing people that this is an important step and that we have to take it all together. It can't be one of those things where we say, well, whatever suits you is fine. If you choose to do this, we will have to all make this choice together, or else it won't be enough. And so this has shown us proof positive that it won't be depriving ourselves as individuals. It's something like the 100 top companies are responsible for 70% of carbon emissions. We have to hold those people responsible. And we can't do that as individuals. We have to do that together.
I have a question. I'm sure you guys have heard about that proposition that passed that California will only be able to have electric cars by 2035. Do you think that's going to be feasible? And if it's feasible here, do you think they're going to do it in other states?
That's a great question. What do you think, Dr. Terrell?
I have thoughts on that too. I do think it's very feasible. And I think that it's the kind of thing where things don't seem feasible until you hit a tipping point and all of a sudden they're obvious. It'll be one of those things But the good news is the way as California goes, so must everyone else, because California on its own would be like the 5th largest economy in the world. And so there's no way that you can create that kind of demand for electric cars and not have a ripple effect through all the, and it's not just California, it's going to be California plus many, several other countries in the world have already committed. Just today, there was news that lots of countries have now committed to be carbon neutral by the year 2050. And they're moving back their deadlines or moving up their commitments. But we just have to keep the pressure on. The momentum has to grow, I think. So I think it's feasible, but we can't let it happen. We have to make sure it happens.
Great. Well, I want to be sensitive to everybody's time and not keep you up too late. But I want to thank everybody for this wonderful event and for all of the events. I think they've really been fantastic. If you have any follow-up questions for any of us, we would all be happy to take them via email, or you can set up a time to talk to us at your convenience. We'll be happy to set up a Zoom chat to have further conversations about this. So have a wonderful night, everybody. Thanks so much. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening, guys.
And
Thank you.
Thank you.
and Taylor, you're still here, right? You asked that question.
Yeah,
I was hoping you'd stick around so I can answer it. It's all worth it, but it's not worth it because it's going to single-handedly be enough. It's worth it because we want to all be part of moving in the right direction. And if we can't decide it's worth it as individuals, we will never decide it's worth it as society. So I know that feels like we want to be the one who makes a difference, but we make a difference by acting in good faith and hoping everyone else joins us. That's what I would say. I think it's if you make that choice, it's definitely worth it because it will take other people making that same decision, or else we'll never get there.
Well, like for me, like my point on it is just like I feel like it causes much more of a distraction for people. Like they find like their excuse is I'm not going to hold those companies accountable because I'm doing my part. So I feel like it's an scapegoat by those companies to blame society for what they're causing.
Yeah,
So.
I agree. I was going to say, like, you're absolutely right. It's because I agree with Dr. Terrell as well. It all does matter, but it also is a bit of a red herring that benefits the status quo. The focus that we have on individualism, turning environmental problems into individual problems, is something that benefits the status quo. So we need to be aware of that as well, and call it out for what it is, while at the same time making choices that are ethical as in terms of where we're going, which involves, of course, the choices we make about what to eat and the choices we make about where to shop and whether to drive and all of those other things. But I think you're absolutely right calling it out for what it is. And it's a strategy that benefits the ones that benefit from the status quo.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for your time. I'm actually really excited about this topic and everything. So thank you.
Thanks for being here.
I'm sure we'll be chatting a lot in the future, all of us. Great. Bye.